I'm very pleased to be participating in this very important conference today, and it always is such a great event here in Vietnam to help build capacity, help understanding food testing, and help understanding how we can all work together to do a much better job. This morning I want to spend some time and talk to you about the AOAC International stakeholder process for developing standards and using SMPRs. This is a term I want to introduce to you today, and it stands for Standard Method Performance Requirements. This is what we're going to talk about today as a tool that we're going to use to develop new standards and new test methods. So the outline I want to go through today is understanding this stakeholder process is best done by using the example of SPIFAN, the Stakeholder Panel on Infant Formula and Adult Nutritionals. This is the group that pioneered this process and has the most experience with it. So I'll share this process with you, understand the different steps that are taken in this process, and then look at how this group of infant formula laboratories have been very successful in developing these standards and using them not only for AOAC official test methods, but for Codex Alimentarius standards as well. So the background with infant formula and why we began this process with infant formula. Those of you that have worked with infant formula, it's the most highly regulated product in the world, and it requires very, very good test methods. We found that we had a number of our test methods that were out of date. There were some very new and modern infant formulas with novel ingredients that were causing challenges with our test methods. So we really need to look at what those gaps were, where we needed new standards, and then go about following the process I'll describe to you this morning to look at improving those standards. So this current program is designed to provide a collaborative program in order to look at what the gaps were, what testing standards were needed, and how we would go about creating those standards. And then ultimately we had hoped that we would gain approval for these test methods to become Codex Type 2 dispute resolution methods. So clearly a process of this sort requires a great deal of effort. So all of the infant formula manufacturers around the world joined this process to help us, as well as different government agencies from around the world, different contract research organizations, technology providers, reference material providers, as well as other standards developing organizations to help us become successful. This is a list of all of the countries where we had scientists that helped us with this program and continue to help us with programs that are moving on into the future. A quick look at the organization of AOAC International, and I won't spend a lot of time here, but so you understand the different steps that are taken. The standards begin with the SMPRs that we're going to talk about, and then validation studies occur and standard methods approval processes occur, and then other tools are provided to help the laboratories implement these test methods and use them successfully. So the quick look at the standards development process begins with an advisory panel that decides what the priorities are. Then a very large group of stakeholders come together to define the process and define what the test method requirements are. Then we have very technically focused working groups that work out the details of the SMPRs. Once these SMPRs are approved, we go about validation studies, and we have expert review panels that then look at the methods that are validated in this system, compare them to the SMPRs, and decide if we have effective working standards. So in a flow diagram, this is how this process works. The advisory panel tells the stakeholders what the priorities are for implementation. The stakeholders agree on the priorities they want to work on. They form the technically focused working groups that then begin to establish and gain approval for SMPRs. We call for methods, we validate the methods, and through the process we begin to validate, approve, and codify these very important standards. So what is a stakeholder panel? They are very large groups of people, much like we have gathered today. Everyone that's interested in the analysis of infant formula or whatever project we're working on are called together to have the discussion of what the test methods should be capable of doing. We have this discussion, we move forward with some scientific discussions that are done by the technically focused working groups. These are people that have expertise in the analysis of the analytes that we're working on and the different nutrients that we're looking at. They develop the details of the SMPR that then are used by the expert review panels into the future. So a standard method performance referred to as SMPRs. This might be difficult to read, but this is what an SMPR looks like. Once everything's agreed upon by the stakeholders and by the working groups, it is sent out for a vote for approval. If it in fact is approved, it's codified by AOAC International and given an official number. It's then published. So we're on record as stating what our preferences are and what our requirements are for individual test methods. So what is the definition of an SMPR and what does it include? So the applicability statement. So working with nutrients in infant formula, we need to define that we want to measure total vitamin A in infant formula and adult nutritionals. We wanted to keep our scope very clear and very focused so that we didn't have any creep in our projects. We then needed to define exactly what we're going to measure. If we're looking at vitamin A, what forms of vitamin A do we need to measure? What's the performance of this method need? What type of precision? What type of accuracy? What type of reproducibility? Where do we find reference materials? And how do we go about finalizing the validation of this method? So let's look quickly at the different steps that we go through in the development of these standards. We begin with the priorities that we establish with areas of interest, and then those are taken to our stakeholders into a presentation. We begin with identifying and appointing a working group chair, someone who has expertise with infant formula and someone that has knowledge of the tests that we're going to perform. They then outline the project, present it to the stakeholders for further discussion. The stakeholders review this and look at it and then appoint a technically focused working group. It's important that we have these working groups because we need to have expertise in the analytes that we're working on and the ability to learn how the best approach would be to these different standards. After the working group is formed and they have some review, they draft what the SMPRs would look like. Whenever we have a draft of a document, we need to have our stakeholders' input both in our meetings and electronically. So we post these SMPRs on the AOAC website and we ask for comments. We take all of the comments back to the working group and we answer all of the questions before we move forward. Once we've had all of the questions answered, we'll then vote on the SMPR and decide if it's ready to move forward into our process. We may revise the SMPR depending on these comments once we finalize it, and then we will publish this standard in AOAC official methods of analysis. So this standard method performance requirement documents the community's need for test methods. It is a very detailed description of what the requirements are, what we need to have before we'll consider a method for approval. It includes the method acceptance requirements, which I'll talk about more in just a minute, and it is, as I've mentioned, published as a standard. How do we use these SMPRs? When we go about looking for methods, we use this as the basis to identify acceptability or probability of a method meeting our requirements. We use it as guidance for the method developers and those that are going to look at developing or modifying methods in order to meet this important standard. We use particular direction and address the specific analytical needs of what we're looking at, and it allows us to reach a broader community consensus of the standards and the things that we want to be looking at. So the format includes very much of what you would look for when you're looking for an analytical method in the laboratory. The intended use for this method, the applicability, the technique, and all the definitions that we need for a proper determination using a test method. We need to identify the system suitability so that we can have as robust a method as possible. We need to identify reference materials because as soon as we validate methods, we want to be able to have ongoing data collection in all of our laboratories to make sure that we're performing this analysis correctly. We need to give validation guidance. We need to tell the laboratories how much validation we require before we'll consider these standards for approval in the AOAC process. We need to identify the maximum time to determination. We aren't necessarily focused on rapid methods, but at the same time, we need methods that won't take several days to complete if we can get this done in a faster time frame. And then the method performance requirements. This is everything that you need to know in the laboratory. The analytical range, what sort of range do we need to measure? What's the limit of detection? What's the limit of quantification? What do we need to measure at what concentration? What's the repeatability of this method? That's the performance, the variability of this method in one laboratory. What is the reproducibility? How much variability will we have when this method is used in multiple laboratories? And the recovery, how close to the true value are we with this test method? So AOAC has adopted hundreds of SMPRs, and I would encourage everyone, if they have an opportunity, to look in the literature and review some of these. In addition to the infant formula projects, we have projects for agricultural products, food products, for nutrients, and for contaminants. So very comprehensive in activities, and this is the basis now for all of the AOAC standards development processes. This is truly a global scope, so we are not only working in the United States, but we have engaged Europe and Asia as well. And building upon this infant formula platform, we've engaged partners from other standard setting organizations, ISO, the International Standards Organization, and IDF, the International Dairy Federation. They also have test methods for infant formula, and we wanted to harmonize between all three agencies. So we had one method that we all agreed upon, and we worked together to do just that. We reviewed all of the different requirements for the different agencies. We harmonized the validation process, and we gained approval then through all of these different groups. Once we had approval by all three organizations, we then applied to Codex Alimentarius to have these standards approved as Codex Type 2 dispute resolution methods. Now, Codex standards are recognized in 180 countries as standards for the analysis of infant formula. So we now have agreed if there's any disputes, any trade disputes, any government challenges for infant formula, we have identified the test method that will be used to resolve these disputes and is defined as the true value for the determination of these infant formula test methods. So the accomplishments are here, and they're many. This process has been very effective, and we have identified standard method performance requirements for all 30 of the nutrients that are required in an infant formula. We have completed about half of those through the Codex process. We have a total of 60 new AOAC official methods, and we have a number of others that we're currently working on to begin the Codex activities coming next year as we continue to move forward. These are the methods that have been approved by Codex in the nutrient arena for infant formula. We now have agreed upon one standard method that will be used by all of the infant formula manufacturers, contract research organizations, and government agencies around the world to test infant formula. So in a quick summary, this stakeholder process, I hopefully have demonstrated, is a very effective process, and it's very thorough. We're using this today on at least 10 different projects in addition to infant formula, and it is working very successfully. These SMPRs are now recognized internationally. People look at those in other geographies and other standards organizations. Codex is using this as a baseline now to determine method applicability and method fitness for purpose. And while we continue to work on harmonizing these with other groups, we will continue to work through the standard method performance requirements, validate new methods, and continue to publish those so all the laboratories all over the world, including Vietnam, can have access to these very, very useful standards.